Good evening and welcome. Welcome to one of our Civility lectures. They're sponsored by the Dylan Schneider Group, Hearst Media, and the Ferguson Library. The Civility series has been together since 2012, always bringing top experts into the library to talk about civility. I'm particularly delighted tonight about the topic, William F. Buckley. I don't know that many of you know that William F. Buckley was a very good friend to the Ferguson Library. Over the years, not only was he one of our book and author luncheon speakers, when the foundation held one of our first fundraisers, it was William F. Buckley who was the featured speaker. He also left us a really nice gift, and that is his library. After he passed. And so when you leave here tonight, if you take a stop down on in the main lobby, in front of the elevator, there are there's an exhibit set up of some of the books that are really special in the collection, as well as a timeline. And so without further ado, because we're really here tonight to hear our author speak, I want to introduce John Breunig, who will be the moderator tonight. And of course, he is from Hearst Media.
Good evening. We had technical difficulty. Sam Tanenhaus, he's probably best known as former editor of the New York Times Book Review and as the author of the biography of Whittaker Chambers. Personally, I suspect his literary achievement as William F. Buckley's biographer will rewrite his own reputation. I think Bill Buckley could not have written this book. He just didn't have the patience. He wrote, I mean, look at it by the numbers. He wrote, and please correct me if I'm wrong, 5,500 or so columns. He hosted Firing Line for 33 years, right? He edited National Review for 35 years. But he knew what he was doing when he handed this assignment over to Sam Tanenhaus. And again, another number, 27 years ago.
Well, let's not get hung up on the number.
Okay, I know, it's a controversial number. But Bill Buckley's final words in this book are, "I know I won't see my biography," which he uttered just a few weeks before his death in 2008. 17 years later, 17 years after Bill Buckley's death, and this is the 100th anniversary year of his birth, I encourage all of you to embrace the hard work Sam's done for all of us as readers. I wish all biographies offered the rich rewards of such deep, deep research. You can't often say an author of and I'm going without the footnotes, 868-page book showed restraint, but you will in this case. One of Sam's writing gifts is a knack for elegantly ending chapters in a way that lures you to keep reading into the next chapter. I'm going to give you just one sample. When he's talking about Bill Buckley's first and probably still most famous book, God and Man at Yale, he ends the chapter by writing, "God and Man at Yale was more than an audacious performance by a very young man and contained the seeds of a modern movement." Unless we gathered on a sailboat on Long Island Sound a few miles from here tonight, I can't imagine a more appropriate setting than a library Bill Buckley supported in the city he called home for more than 50 years. And before we officially get started, because this is a Stanford audience and this is unique for Sam, I just want to take a quick poll. How many people here knew Bill Buckley personally at all? Don't be shy. Okay. How many of you considered him a neighbor? Okay. Anybody, was he a fellow sailor? Anybody sail? Oh, okay. You knew him on the water. But you knew him on the water. Okay. Did anybody know him from church? St. Mary's Church? Okay. Anybody spot him at Jimmy Seasides or Colony Grill? These are the local haunts. Were you at Colony Grill with him? Around the corner. You all recognize that too. Since this is part of our Civility in America series, I talked to a few people I know about Bill Buckley's own civility, including a bartender and waitress from Jimmy Seaside. everybody recalls him as a gentleman, one-on-one. And I realized this was true in every encounter I had with him professionally as well. I once edited an essay. I was working for a while, side work for Yachting magazine, just helping them with some editing. I knew the editor. And I approached the editor-in-chief with a suggested correction of Bill Buckley's column. And he looked at me and he said, you want me to tell Bill Buckley he used a word wrong? And I said, I'm happy to call him myself. I already knew him. He says, nah, I'll do it. He was the editor-in-chief. And he came back a few minutes later and he said, Mr. Buckley would like to thank you for the correction. That's civility. A few years later, when I was Stanford Advocate city editor, he asked for a press credential to cover Joe Lieberman's first news conference in 2000 when he was the vice presidential candidate. The first stop with him and Al Gore was in Stanford. Bill Buckley came off his boat straight to the newsroom, sunburned, soggy. He wanted to pick up his credential. A couple of years later, he called again when Joe Lieberman announced at Stanford High School he was running for president. This time, I pushed back a little, and I said, why do you need a press credential? You're William F. Buckley. But again, civility. That's who he was. He wanted to do things the right way. So welcome to Stanford, Sam, and I'm going to ask you maybe to start with your own observations about Bill Buckley's civil nature.
Thanks so much for that, John. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I'm guessing one reason not many hands went up when you asked about Bill the neighbor is because he lived in Wallack's Point, right? And it's interesting how many people in the area have never heard of Wallack's Point. And I live in Connecticut, too. My wife and I moved here about 10 years ago, Essex, Connecticut. And no one there has ever heard of it either. But it's a beautiful area for those of you who've seen it. And it was Pat Buckley who found the house, by the way. She said she looked at 40 homes out here when they'd come back from Mexico. Bill had very briefly been in the CIA working for E. Howard Hunt, and they came to Connecticut, and she made the trips. She chose the house. So I'll tell you about the civility of Bill Buckley by describing my very first encounters with him. And I like to say I'm going to turn 70 in October. In the years since, well, I've been a journalist, I like to say I have widened the swath of my anonymity. But 35 years ago, when I first met him, I was really a nobody from nowhere. And I wanted to meet with him. I really needed his cooperation for a book I was writing. It was a biography of Whittaker Chambers that John mentioned. I was 33 or 34, I'd written very little. I got it in my head that I wanted to write about Chambers, someone I really didn't know that much about. And for those of you who aren't familiar with him, though I suspect quite a few in this audience are, he was one of the most notorious or heroic figures in the early Cold War through the Alger Hiss spy case, the perjury and spy case. Chambers had been the accuser, confessing that he'd been a spy, a Soviet spy, and Hiss had been his Confederate. And he was quite despised and reviled for his testimony for many, many years. But Bill Buckley and his 9 siblings all admired him. They were all anti-communists, and Chambers was also a very talented, gifted, prophetic writer. And that was the aspect of Chambers that was most interesting to Bill Buckley. And so I wrote to him and introduced myself, dear Mr. Buckley. And of course, these are the days when you actually typed a letter and put it in an envelope and stuck it in the mail and hoped for the best. And I got a note from him not much later, and he said, well, I'd like to help you out, but someone else is supposed to be working on this book. He's been kind of a disappointment. In other words, he hadn't done a lot of work on it, but I'll talk to you anyway. So then I went, he invited me to National Review not long after that. And he had a little research foundation that gave me a small grant. This is what Bill Buckley would do. Once he took up your case, then he became your great advocate and ally. And he loved doing this. He loved opening doors and making phone calls. He had the temperament of kind of a cross between a president and a CEO. He just liked to make things happen, and he would do it very easy, quick ways. And so not long after he had decided he was interested in this project and thought maybe I could do it, he invited my wife and me to dinner. And we were living in Tarrytown. A lot of you must know Tarrytown, right? Not far from here, Westchester County. We had a little apartment near the railroad station, very little money. And he called me up, and I wish I could do voices. There are probably people here who can. I can't, but I have a good memory for the words people use. And he invited us to dinner, and I said, well, how do I get to your house? And he said, well, you access Interstate I-95, and you pursue it until it debouches at exit 9. And I turned to my wife, and I said, he sounds exactly the way he does on TV, for those of you who remember the program. So then my wife and I looked at each other kind of panic-stricken. Bill and Pat Buckley in 1990 were the reigning socialites in New York. And my wife and I were the furthest, look at me, furthest thing from socialites. And so we didn't know what to wear. It wasn't just Bill, by the way, and I don't want to sound piggish when I say this, but women in the audience will especially know. This was Pat Buckley's house. And Pat Buckley was responsible for the Met Gala that still goes on and all this other stuff. She knew everybody, moved in very exalted circles. And we didn't know what to do. I mean, I had my wedding suit, which I could still fit into. My wife had nice dresses, but we didn't know what to wear. And then about an hour later, the phone rang, and it was Bill again. He always told you to call him Bill. As soon as you met him, everyone, people who worked in the mailroom called him Bill. Right? You, John, you always called him Bill, right? Once you got to know him, always. It was never Mr. Buckley. He immediately brushed that aside. It was always Bill. He called, and he said, Pat wants me to know you should wear beach clothes. And we looked at each other and we thought, what are beach clothes? We didn't know what they were, but we knew what they weren't. He was telling us not to dress up. So that was the first hint to me that somebody in that household was actually thinking of us. And if any of you here have met famous people, one attribute many of them have in common is they treat you like a piece of furniture. They're not interested in you. They're interested in themselves, right? That's where they got to be where they are. And if you're a journalist, as I am, you cover a lot of important people, not through any great, accomplishment of one's own. It's your job to do this. And Bill Buckley was the first person of that stature I ever met who actually was interested in me as a person, and also my wife. So then we go out to the house. We find our way there, and it's at the end of this gravel drive. I don't want people invading his home because Christopher Buckley, his son, still lives there, one of his several homes. Beautiful stucco villa overlooking the Sound. And on close, not quite 3 acres, on this, this gated community. And we were ushered into the music room, as he called it. And my wife reminded me the other day that Pat called it the elephant's graveyard. It was all these old photographs and posters. Bill's famous clavichord, which some of the world's best musicians had not just played, but recorded albums, was there in the music room. And Pat swept in. She came in a little later with a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel on each arm. And my wife, Kathy, is great with animals. That she loves them, and they love her, and Pat picked up on this. So when we went out to dinner, meanwhile, you're being waited on by Spanish-speaking help who were Cuban refugees. Bill grew up this way, only when he was a child, they were Mexican refugees. Now, from the time of the Mexican Revolution, now they're Cuban immigrants from Castro's Cuba. And Bill and Pat would speak Spanish to them. And you realize pretty soon, other people didn't live this way, but it was very natural for them. It was just the way he'd been raised and she'd been raised. She came from a far wealthier family than he did in Vancouver. So she hands the dogs off to Kathy, and Kathy, is maneuvering her way around the table, and one of the dogs knocked a wine glass onto the floor, and it broke. And instantly, Pat Buckley said, It's from Pottery Barn. It costs $1. Number one, many in the audience know, it was not from Pottery Barn. And number two, even if it was, it didn't cost $1. But that was their way of putting us at ease. And it was then that I discovered, and I discuss this in the book, and it's one of the few points that people who knew Bill Buckley really well said was news to them. He was a fantastic listener. You know, he was famous for his wit, the slashing wit, and the put-downs and one-liners. But when you spoke, he actually sat back and listened to you. And that's when I realized he was just operating on a different plane from other big people I'd known. I want to add one more aspect to that, John, then we can move on. When I was working on this first book, biography of Whittaker Chambers, 1990, it was 30 years after Chambers had died. It's just at the last phase of the Cold War, and there was a lot of dispute and debate about the Alger Hiss spy case. Documents were being released from the former Soviet Union, it was still the Soviet Union then, and in archives in the U.S., and it was a real political football. And there were many conservatives. I'm kind of politically neutral. I write about conservatives, but I'm not part of the movement in any way. And many people I met who were important in that world made it clear to me that the purpose of my book was to prove that, to vindicate Whittaker Chambers, to prove he told the truth in first the House Committee testimony, the HUAC testimony that the young Richard Nixon had supervised, and then later in 2 trials. Bill Buckley was the only person in that cohort of famous conservatives who actually had known Whittaker Chambers, yet he was the only one who said to me, the book is not just about Whittaker, as he called him, it's about you, it's about me as a young writer trying to get ahead and do good work. So there was a largeness about him, and that's where I think the civility began. He could be very tough, as you know, and he could be ad hominem in debate. If you've seen the Gore Vidal or James Baldwin debates, he could really go after you. But there was also the idea that you'd have the conversation. It would be a battle of words, and the best words would win. Or if you didn't have the best words, you'd lose, which he sometimes did.
But that being a good listener made him a great debater, right? I mean, it was sort of this secret. And you know, he was such an, I don't know that you could name anybody else you would define as just the unparalleled master of words, right? He had so many words in his quiver. But that said, how do you rate him as a writer?
He was a far better writer than many of the reviewers of my book are saying. The book's been treated very well. No complaints about that. I do think this is a moment where Bill Buckley's getting kicked around a bit for his attitudes and opinions and the way he expressed them. It's striking to me that, and I think I'm partly responsible for that, beginning with the quote you read from the chapter on God and Man at Yale. The only book of his anybody's talking about now is God and Man at Yale. John mentioned all the writing he did. He didn't mention the more than 50 books. And some of them, the memoirs, the sailing memoirs, and the diaries he wrote when he ran for mayor of New York, and he wrote 2 wonderful diaries, each about 1 week in his life. One was published was written in 1970, and the other was written about a dozen years later. They're really a joy and pleasure to read. He was best as a memoirist. He had a really unusual life. And when I found that when he's Bill Buckley, the conservative observer of the quirks of American or international life, he's really a joy to read. I don't think he was a great philosopher or arguer, of polemicist of opinions, and I think that's where he's getting hit a little bit.
You know, I had marked this down. For me, if I had a favorite sentence in the book that's purely your writing, your opining, it was this one. He was a conversationalist, not a thinker, and still less a theorist. I could spend an hour just unspooling that sentence with you. It probably to the audience, it seems radical to say that Bill Buckley was not even suggest he was not a deep thinker, but he did seem to hypnotize audiences into not realizing that occasionally he was not digging that deep into the issues.
No. I think you put your finger on it before, John. This how I think of him. And while I was working on the book, this became clearer to me. He was not the best, certainly not the best writer of his time. He was not the best conservative writer or thinker. There were others who were better. But he was the most articulate person, probably, of his entire era. His words came to him, just as you said, so naturally and fluently, and with a kind of music about them. And there are two explanations for that. One is, some of you may know this, and if not, you'll discover it. English was not Buckley's first language. It was his third language. His first language was Spanish, because he was raised by servants. I think sometimes that the most effective, or one of the most effective political movements of modern American history is the result of the sixth child of 10 feeling very lonely when he was growing up, needing a lot of company around him. So he built orbits of that turned into a movement. The other reason he was so good with language, so he was always trying to catch up, because he had older brothers and sisters who were all very bright. He was not the most intelligent or most gifted of his siblings. That gave him an curious kind of modesty you didn't expect from him. Bill Buckley never said he was a great writer. He would always point to other writers who were better. His favorite writer was Norman Mailer. They didn't agree about everything, but he thought Mailer was the greatest writer of their time. And Norman Mailer would get on his motorcycle and ride up to Wallack's Point. Yeah, see him. The other reason for the unusual quality of Buckley's prose and speaking style was that his secret wish had been to be a musician. He wanted to be a pianist. And he just didn't have the talent for it. He was pretty good. I mean, not as good as, anywhere near as good as he wanted to be. Not as good as his sister Trish, who was a better musician and studied at the Mannes School in New York. And this was a book I worked on for so long that I actually interviewed Bill Buckley's childhood piano teacher. That's how long I was working on this. And she said he didn't play the piano well. She said, in fact, he played rather badly, but with a bravado that made you think he was better than he was. And I thought, well, you could apply a lot of that to Bill Buckley. A lot of it was the style and flair and humor that he brought to language and to debating and to life in general.
It made me think of that when you mentioned Mailer and the motorcycle. I think a lot of readers who read the book will be surprised by what a daredevil Bill Buckley was. I mean, really surprised by what a daredevil was as a skier, as a sailor, as a flyer, and he was a daredevil with money too. Some of you may know that, I know it's in Chris Buckley's book too, his nickname for the way he approached the docks, his nickname very aggressively, right, was Captain Crunch. But such a memorable story in the book that takes place in Connecticut is that early flying story. And I'm wondering if you could share some of that.
Well, Bill Buckley was a freshman at Yale in 1946. That was the first year, really, after the war, when students were coming in on the GI Bill. Something I point out is Bill Buckley was opposed to many public programs. He did not object to the GI Bill, even though he didn't need it, because it meant he could buy a car. And he also went in with friends, including his brother, and bought an airplane. It was a plane called an Ercoupe, E-R-C-O-U-P-E, probably pronounced Aircoupe. And when you do my kind of work, you always have to know more than the subject tells you. So Bill Buckley says, well, this was a cheap plane you could buy. That's supposed to be easy to fly, and it was. You steered it just the way you would steer a car. So it was meant for amateurs. But I also found, when I researched it a little bit, that it was a really dangerous plane because it was hard to land. And Bill Buckley landed it twice when he really had no idea what he was doing. And the first time was when he and a classmate flew to Boston, and the classmate had been an airman in World War II. He was a pilot. So they flew together. Bill Buckley had taken a few lessons and found it very easy. He found it ridiculously easy, as he would describe it. So they flew to Boston, and his friend went off to keep his appointment. Suddenly, Bill Buckley realizes he's a plane in Boston that he has to get back to New Haven. So what a sane person would do was get a taxi, call a friend. If you're Bill Buckley, who's never landed a plane before, you decide this is the first time you're going to do it. So he flew back as night was approaching, and he was able to get to the airfield by lowering the altitude to the point where he could see the lights along the coastline. And he landed pretty close.
The train tracks, too, right? He followed the train
tracks.
tracks.
Followed the line of the train tracks. And he was very pleased with himself and was sitting in a bar telling a friend about it until he got an irate phone call from the flight instructor who said that he and others had driven out to the local airport, the Bethany Airport airfield, to wait for Buckley. The plane had never arrived, and they assumed he'd been killed. And instead, there he was in New Haven. And but then he flew a second time when he decided his best friend and soon-to-be brother-in-law, L. Brent Bozell, if that name means anything to anybody here. He was Bill Buckley's great ideological compadre. They wrote a famous book in defense of Joe McCarthy together, and were the big political conservatives at Yale in the 1940s. And Brent had fallen in love with the sister Bill was closest to. Bill was constantly trying to match up his sisters with men. And the interesting is, he didn't care what their politics were. He wanted one of his sisters to marry William Sloane Coffin, who became, remember, the left-wing chaplain at Yale, anti-war chaplain at Yale. As long as they seemed like nice guys, and especially if they were religious, and even more than that, Catholic, Bill was ready to marry them all off. Well, Bozell and Bill's sister Trish were an item, and Bill realized that his younger sister Maureen had yet to be introduced to Brent, so they should meet. And the solution was for Bill Buckley and Brent Bozell to fly in that little air coupe to the Ethel Walker School, right near Simsbury, where Maureen was going to school. And so he asked Maureen to draw a map or give him some kind of information, so a kind of flight plan, so he'd be able to land the plane. And all that came back in the mail were squiggles indicating trees. And Bill Buckley flew anyway and told his friend Brent, not a problem. I've been to the Ethel Walker campus, I think 6 years ago in 1943, when another one of my sisters was graduating. So they flew overhead. They flew, short distance, and they're circling overhead. And Buckley realizes, if you've ever seen the campus, that is a building surrounded by very tall trees, and he has no idea how he's going to land the plane. And he just kind of closes his eyes, pulls the throttle, and down they go. And they hit the ground, but they're going good 70 miles an hour. And he looks over at Bozell very triumphantly, and Bozell's white as a sheet. He thinks Buckley's going to kill him. And they speed along the grounds, and he's diminishing his speed. He's brought it down to about 30 miles an hour. And there's this tremendous jolt because there was a drainage ditch that the wheels had hit. And, of course, Buckley hadn't bothered to find out any of this. The plane was torn to pieces, and he never flew again. And he promised his wife, Pat, when he married her, he would never fly. And to me, it was fascinating. I say in the book, this was a good way for Brent Bozell to find out what he was getting into, marrying into the Buckley family. But it showed you his amazing self-confidence.
Right. It wasn't fake, right?
No. Yeah. And physical courage. He wasn't afraid to do it. Same thing with the skiing.
Yeah.
And there were casualties. Other people sometimes paid the price for his daring. And some would say many paid the price for Bill Buckley's daring approach to politics.
Alice had mentioned, and it reminded me, in 2005, I can't see Alice, but I was there. There was an event in 2005 honoring Bill. It was at the Marriott, and but it was to benefit the Ferguson. He was presented with an award. And during the interview, I remember he was asked what role religious faith played in his writing. And his response was nothing, no effect. Yeah, I think he pointed out the one book, but no effect at all. I would disagree. You know, there's probably a good Bill Buckley word there to say boulderdash, right? How do you see faith reflected in his work?
Oh, I think you're right, John, and he was wrong. One of his best last books is a memoir called "A Nearer My God," which is a memoir of his Catholicism. It's interesting, when the book came out, one of the first interviews I did, this is the age of the podcast. So when your book comes out, you do endless podcasts. And by endless, I mean not only a lot of them, but they'll go on for 2 or 3 hours. And this was with Andrew Sullivan, the writer. Some of you may know him, very brilliant journalist from England, who's also Catholic. And he said to me he wished there had been more on Catholicism in the book. And I'd taken some material out because the book was already so long. So I sent it to Commonweal magazine instead. And they did a portion of a chapter on it. And it deals with the most controversial thing Bill Buckley ever wrote, which is a critique of a papal encyclical that John the 23rd issued. You know, there's kind of a papal letter, kind of advisory letter that's sent out. It doesn't state doctrine. It's more of a kind of the Pope being shepherd to the flock. And Bill Buckley thought it wasn't anti-communist enough. So he denounced it in National Review, and that created a furor that went all across the ideological spectrum, because liberal and conservative Catholics were offended by that. And Bill Buckley didn't understand why. He thought it was an honest disagreement. And one of his many brilliant proteges, great historian and religious writer, Gary Wills, thought it was one of the most daring things and admirable things Bill Buckley did. It actually kind of helped get Wills started on his own remarkable career as a writer, because Buckley wasn't afraid to challenge authority. And but more important than that, of course, was the abiding faith that he had. It made him believe that the causes he took up were not only supported by his own belief in their rightness, but also because he tried to live them out. There's something else Andrew Sullivan pointed out to me, with the creed of charity, which is really the highest value in Catholic teaching, you know, faith, hope, and charity. Charity really comes first, and charity means sympathy and generosity. Bill Buckley was tremendously philanthropic. You've already mentioned some of the gifts, and that he wouldn't think twice about them. If there was something you liked and he thought he could get it for you, he would give it to you, and he wouldn't think twice about it. And he liked to help his friends. He helped poor people, even if he was opposed to a politics, what he would think of as a welfare state politics, great society, big government politics. But he thought it could be made up through personal philanthropy. Well, I think most of us know it can't. But that was his idea, that if it was up to him, he would do it that way. And so some of the most important discoveries I found researching this book had to do with the family's relationship with the black domestic help, as they used to call it, in the South, where they had their second home, by the way. That's, I think, some of the news in the book is that, well, Bill Buckley was raised in Sharon, Connecticut. I just did an event there last weekend. On the northwest corner, you know, that beautiful part near Lakeville and Salisbury, right near the Berkshires, just below the Berkshires and just east of Dutchess County. So I tell people, when Bill Buckley was growing up, being instructed to hate the evil Franklin Roosevelt, that was the guy he saw at the horse show in Rhinebeck when all the Buckley children competed. Franklin Roosevelt would be there. So very much a kind of inside upper class politics he had. But the philanthropy was so important to how he viewed politics, He tried to write in a generous and charitable way. I'll give you one more example of that, John, that really goes back to civility. Because the debate Bill Buckley was most embarrassed about, many of you may know, was his notorious exchange with Gore Vidal in 1968, which I'll briefly describe for those you aren't familiar with. There was a good film about it called Best of Enemies that won an Oscar.
You're in that film,
I'm
right?
in it.
Yeah.
I am not one of the producers. Some people think I produced it. I wish I had. I didn't. I'm a talking head along with some others. And film came out, I guess, about 10 years ago. But it describes the dozen debates Bill Buckley and Gore Vidal had in 1968 at first the Republican nominating convention in Miami, and then the Democrats convention in Chicago, the one that had the famous protests and then the police riot, as it was called. Although there were more people killed in Miami than Chicago, there was also an uprising there on the other side of the causeway. They were in Miami Beach, and in Miami there was an actual confrontation of black citizens and police. At any rate, Buckley and Vidal really were oil and water. And I think it's because they were similar in so many ways, and same accents, you know, these kind of upper crust, mid-Atlantic sort of accents. They were both these exclusive private schools, and they were both prodigies. Vidal published his first novel when he was 19. God Man at Yale was published when Bill was 25. So they're already famous young men. And here they are middle-aged, squaring off. And they had a pretty foul exchange that some of you know, where Vidal called Buckley a Nazi, and Buckley called Vidal a queer. This on television in 1968. It was actually bleeped in a lot of markets. And Bill Buckley was mortified about that for the rest of his life. But not only that, this has been confirmed for me by other people too. I knew Bill Buckley from about 1990 until he died in 2008. I never heard him once disparage Gore Vidal in conversation. And I mentioned that to Vidal's biographer, Fred Kaplan, and he said, well, that's interesting, because I never heard Vidal say anything about Buckley that wasn't disparaging. And that was part of the
Civility.
Civility. Yeah. You didn't speak that way. I remember once asking Buckley, there was another conservative writer who criticized him and criticized his arguments, kind of ridiculed him. And I said, well, what do you think of that? Is that something that you laugh off, or does it upset you? And he said, I don't like it. He said, for instance, I would never say Gore Vidal is a bad writer. In other words, here's somebody he really despised, but he would never make a false accusation like that. He knew Vidal was a really good writer, and he would acknowledge that about him. It seems obvious to us now, but it's not the way conversation goes forward and on. I
have a column, I often write about, this is sort of my pet peeve, like for people, if you grew up rooting for a certain sports team, it's hard to sway. If you grew up in a political persuasion in your household, it's unusual to see somebody sway, not always from that. You know, William F. Buckley was an avatar of modern conservatism, right? But his conservatism was inherited. And you know, I think you'd agree with me. You could have written the entire book about his childhood, right? And just focused on that period. It is just fascinating. But can you touch on areas where his politics evolved a little?
One important area was race and civil rights. Although we think of Bill Buckley as almost a kind of comic version of a patrician Yankee, he wasn't. His parents were both from the South, the deep South, and he was raised with Southern attitudes. His father was from South Texas. He grew up poor in South Texas. His mother was from a middle-class family in New Orleans. And those areas are important because, for one thing, there are two regions in the country with a lot of Catholics. French Catholics in New Orleans, and Tejano, as we call them now, Catholics in southern Texas. So that made the parents, gave them a religious set of attitudes that are surprising. We would not identify with conservatives. For instance, Bill Buckley and the household servants, including black servants, all went to church together in the same cars when they were raised, because the church is open to all, judges all equally. Now, that can also mean, that can be the pretext for opposing social programs that might be advantageous to the disadvantaged. So those attitudes came from home. And some of the papers I was able to see, you know, when you do this kind of work, you're always looking for documentation. And sometimes I say that, you know, to be a good biographer, you would like to have the eye of a novelist, the ear of a poet, and the soul of a police detective, because you just really want to find out what happened and where the bodies are buried and all the rest. And so some of the most important papers I found are not in the enormous Buckley archive at Yale University, which has been confirmed for me is the size and scope of a presidential archive. It's 1,000 boxes, he was a pack rat, so it's got a lot of stuff in it. But the most important papers I found were in a completely different archive that his son Christopher alerted me to, and that's in Camden, South Carolina, where the Buckley's winter home was. And there I learned about the newspaper the Buckleys had founded and supported that defended segregationists in the South. For those of you familiar with this history, it was a paper that supported the white citizens' councils, who were called the Uptown Klan. They did not wear hoods and they did not flog and lynch people, but they made your life pretty miserable if you were, say, a supporter of the NAACP. And Bill Buckley's family supported this quite reactionary newspaper. At the same time, 1950s, that he was just getting National Review off the ground. And at the same time that the Buckleys personally, and then we get back to the civility and charity, were incredibly kind to the people who worked for them. And my wife and I learned this because we interviewed somebody who had been one of 11 children who worked as domestics for the Buckleys in Camden, South Carolina. This man, Edward Allen, who's still alive, he's about 90. I still hear from him. Send him a copy of the book, and he sends me notes. He left Camden, eventually moved up north and fine career, and sent his daughters to college, and, you know, flourished in the way that in those later years it became possible for black citizens to do. But remembering the Buckleys in an earlier time, before the Brown decision in 1954, the time of legalized segregation, he said every family in town wanted to work for the Buckleys, and he said, I walk by that house even now. The house is now in disarray, kind of like Gone with the Wind after the war, just fallen apart, ramshackle. But he said, every time I walk by that house, I look up to the heavens and thank God for the Buckleys. The Buckleys were the first family who kept people on the payroll. They were part of the winter colony who traveled down. And when they came back up north, they either brought servants with them or found jobs for them to do in Camden, or other families for them to work for. Bill Buckley's father, who was an unreconstructed segregationist of the most extreme kind, a great friend of Strom Thurmond, paid for Edward Allen's siblings to go to college. And for me as a writer, those are the most challenging and interesting pages in the book, to tell the story of the Buckleys in the South. Well, what happens after that is, over time, we talked about how Bill was a great listener. And for all his brilliance, this is one reason that I think it's wrong to think of him as a philosopher or deep thinker, is he gained experience the way most of us do, through interactions with the people he met. And as he got to know more and more people, he became more open-minded. So nowadays, anybody who wants to know what the Black Panthers, Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver sounded like, go on Firing Line and see Bill Buckley debate them. You almost can't see them anywhere else. A few PBS programs have interviews with him. But Bill Buckley was the one who actually brought them on his program, and he started to listen. And here's an interesting paradox, John. It's striking in this moment, is because Bill Buckley was opposed early on, he changed his mind, but when he was young, to integration, that meant he supported black nationalism. So Buckley and his magazine National Review were pro-Malcolm X and opposed to Martin Luther King. So the politics get very complicated in that way. And near the end of his life, when, and I'm sure you're thinking of this, John, when Bill Buckley was asked if he regretted any of his opinions, he said the one he regretted was opposing the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s. Said he thought that the country didn't need them, but he was wrong. And yeah, he admitted it.
There's in Chris Buckley's memoir, which is a lovely book. I'd also encourage, there's a lot of Stanford in his memoir that you'll recognize, and it's about his parents, both of his parents' deaths. He has one little recollection of his father receiving a letter from a teenager asking him, "Mr. Buckley, what is the secret to happiness?" And Bill Buckley writes back, "Don't grow up." And in some ways, Bill Buckley kind of remained who he always was, right, from a child. But I'm wondering if you can share a little about, as you talk about the way he connected with people, we think about TV, right? We think about interviews in the magazine. Can you talk about his letters, the letters from the public?
At the peak of his career, Bill Buckley received 600 letters a week and replied to every one. Now, that doesn't mean he wrote a letter as long as, say, the one Woody Allen seems to have written to Jeffrey Epstein, if you read that story in the Times, describing all the dinners they had together. Sometimes it would just be a line or two. And often it would be dictated in his limousine or on the airplane. But if you wrote to him, you heard back. That's why I heard from him initially, because that was the polite thing to do. And at his best, he could be a really good letter writer. Even better than that, though, John, and this brings us back to that point again, I realize that Bill, the listener, was the remarkable letters other people wrote to him. One of the best books Bill Buckley edited was his collected letters from Whittaker Chambers, which was published in 1969 after Chambers had died. And Buckley had wrote about them in Esquire magazine. It was his first truly great essay. I encourage you to think of Buckley, Bill Buckley, less as an ideologue, though he was one, than as a kind of artist. And I know a phrase I use in the book that's been, I know, is circulating a lot now, is I use the phrase performing ideologue to describe him. And people wonder about that because they say, well, it seems to reduce him to this kind of endless kind of, talking head or moving mouth or something. And I say, no, the emphasis is on the performing, not on the ideologue. It's that it was a performance. And so you did it to, I only know of one or two other people who have had that effect on me. I'm normally a pretty sloppy letter writer. But he was really precise, and he took pride in his ability to do all these things very quickly. Now, are you thinking of letters in particular? Did you get some from him?
No, I just think in the modern day, we think of emails, right? And the idea that he was dealing with written letters.
Yeah.
No, I'm not thinking of specific letters.
Well, that's interesting, too, because Bill Buckley was the first person I ever met who used email. He did a primitive version of it called MCI Mail. Does anyone remember this? Oh, you do, right? You would, your name would be like 15-letter long number, right? It was kind of a code that you had, and then a telegram or something would go out with it, right? What's that? Cards, yes. And I remember getting the first one from him. Bill Buckley loved gadgets, and so he liked the gadget of email. And Christopher and I had sort of a running joke. When Bill Buckley was really young, really up until he was in his 40s, he was the most accurate typist I'd ever seen. He could type 90 words a minute. His sister Trish was even better. She could do 100. And he almost never made a mistake. And I had a line in the book, and I decided to take it out because it seemed a little bit like a cheap shot, that the one keyboard Bill Buckley really mastered was the typewriter, not the piano. But when he got older, his hands started to shift on the keyboard, and you'd get a lot of gibberish from him. So Christopher and I would send notes back to each other. We'd say, well, as WFB would say, and then we would type exclamation points and circles and letters out of sequence. But he loved communicating any way he would. I'll tell you another thing about him that I haven't mentioned before in interviews. He was one of two people I knew who didn't say goodbye when they hung up the phone. Now, here's an odd take on civility. The phone would just crash onto the to the cradle. Remember those when you had the phone and the cradle? The receiver would just slam down. And I realized it's because he didn't like saying goodbye to anybody. So I wouldn't do it. The other person I knew who did that was the editor, Robert Silvers, at the New York Review of Books. I would occasionally write for him. And if he called you up to, change a semicolon to a period or whatever important thing was on his mind, when the conversation was over, the phone would just crash onto the receiver. And I'd never encountered it before. And yet, if you were speaking to him, to Bill Buckley, and you were at a loss for a word, you can bet he knew what that word was, but he would never fill it in for you because it would embarrass him.
Amazing, right?
Yeah, we just wait. We just wait. When my wife first met him, she was very self-conscious because, I misused a word. I said, skillful when I should have said skilled. The kind of thing that would or she used the word insightful. Oh, that's a cliche. Bill would never, ever say anything like that. You remind me of something else, John. When I was at the Times, worked at the Times for a number of years, as John mentioned. And my boss was a great editor, was Bill Keller. Interesting figure because he's also an Irish Catholic, extremely smart, kind of admired Buckley. If you were a Catholic, I don't know how many Catholics are in the room here. If you were a Catholic of a certain generation, Bill Buckley was like beyond a celebrity. He really was a kind of giant. And I said to Bill Keller when he hired me, I knew that Buckley every 2 weeks invited people to his Manhattan apartment, a beautiful apartment on the Upper East Side that Pat had picked out for them. And that's where they did their salons in the city, because that's how the Buckleys lived, in this old style of socialites. And I said to Bill Keller, have you ever been to Buckley's house? And he said, well, he invited me once, but I didn't want to go there and be kicked around by him. And what a
mistake, right?
What a mistake. And I just wanted to say, you really think Bill Buckley would do that? He'd invite you into his home and do that to you? Yeah, he might do it on television, but not I would do it in my home, but not Bill Buckley.
This was a work-related thing. I was talking to Chris Shays, former Congressman Chris Shays today, and I just happened to mention this, you in the book. And I said, well, I sort of knew this. I brought this up. He was, I think this is mentioned in Chris's book, at the memorial service at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Chris Shays was the only sitting Republican who showed up. I mean, Joe Lieberman was there, a Democrat showed up, which is sort of remarkable. But there was a little aside. He said, I loved going to New York occasionally and having dinner. He goes, I always remember dinner started at, I may have this wrong, dinner started at 6:30. You were done at 9:30.
Yeah, so. And that's the other thing he would do. If he took you to lunch, or he would stand up, and then it was time to leave. It was over. He'd say, well, are you ready to go? He'd just stand up, and then you left. And it's the way that really efficient party him, and wrote an exquisitely observed and written book about the Alger Hiss trials. Bill Buckley came to know him, and because of Buckley's intercession, Alistair Cook, who was a big name back then, wrote a blurb for my book, for the Chambers book. And I said, well, how well do you know him? And he said, well, we have lunch every 3 months. I remember thinking, well, that's kind of an odd thing to do. There seems something kind of artificial about it, having lunch with somebody every 3 months. But then I realized how many people I've known in my life, I've said, we have to see each other again. Let's reconnect. And it never happens.
At all.
Never happens at all. Bill Buckley puts it in his calendar. And think about it. If you knew someone for 20 years, let's say, and had a 2-hour lunch with them every 3 months, how well would you know that person after 15 years? You would count that person a genuine friend, somebody you could talk to about just about anything, feel totally comfortable with that person, and you have to multiply that by hundreds to get the sense of what Bill Buckley's life was like. You know, one of the interesting things, looking at the reactions to the book, and they come in all the time. Buckley's a fascinating character, so the book is an opportunity for people to write about him. And I'm surprised at how there's so much in the book about Bill Buckley, the person, but we don't live in an age where that resonates in the same way. And I began to see this in the early interviews I do, that whenever I spoke about Bill Buckley's really human qualities, that's what my wife always says about him. What, sorry?
His humanity.
His humanity, yeah. My wife would always say, he's so human. Yes, very human. That all that gets, will often be brushed aside as if that's camouflage or it's apology or
it's artificial.
Artificial, yeah. And I'm thinking, well, you know, if you live in a world where people are angry all the time and at each other's throats, isn't it nice to know that it's not happening all the time, that you can actually, you know, I remember if you were a young person and told Bill Buckley you were going to join the Communist Party, he would say, how on earth can you do that? It's the biggest mistake you could make, and I cannot support it in any way, and I'll denounce you in my column, but you're coming to dinner tomorrow night, right? And you think, there are worse ways to live than that.
Anthony, I don't know how we are in time. Should we get to questions? Yes, I will. We'll start with questions. I just want to say, please, there's so many treasures in this book, and I love that you just sprinkled in little cameos from these 20th century icons. You know, Charlie Chaplin pops up. There's a lovely story about Fats Waller and Joan Didion and writers. It's just so rich with recognizable bold-faced names too. But yes, I don't want to deny the audience. You have a microphone? Somebody over here.
Something worth reading for those of you who are fans or readers of American poetry is to read Sylvia Plath's description of the Buckley house in Sharon, Connecticut. She lived in the same house at Smith as Bill's sister Maureen, and she was invited to the coming out party. And she wrote a very long letter describing the Buckley estate and what it was like. 1951.
Yeah. Sir.
Thank you for the evening, the presentation. Thank you for the book, which I've started and enjoyed and recommend to anybody who knew Mr. Buckley or admired him or read anything that he did. And thanks to the Ferguson Library for hosting this event. Two questions, one for our author and one for our moderator. Mr. Buckley had a unique relationship with young people, whether it was Young Americans for Freedom or even if you didn't join that organization. Just talk about that a little bit. And, you know, if you were a high school debater in Stanford back in the 1970s, you know, you were watching Firing Line and you were reading his books. I know because I was one of those high school debaters. And as far as reading Mr. Buckley's column, I remember reading it in the New York Post, but I don't recall seeing it in the Stanford Advocate. Am I just misrecollecting?
You are. You know, one time
carried.
He came, again, he would sometimes just stop by the office. Our editor, he would say, hey, you want to get lunch? He would just show up. And one day he came in the office and I grabbed him at the door and I said, you know, this is probably around 20 years ago. And I said, you know, there's kind of a legend around here that your first columns were in the Advocate. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And I'm like, nah, they were, but they were syndicated, right? The Advocate ran them when everybody else did. But yes, we did continue running his column right up until his death. So,
and that's important. Christopher, in his great little book, Losing Mom and Pop, says that Bill Buckley's routine was built around his column. He wrote 3 columns a week. If you think about a really prolific writer in our time, a good columnist like David Brooks or Ezra Klein. I mean, they're doing podcasts and the rest, but they're doing a column a week. Bill Buckley wrote 3, and he started out doing a weekly column. Then it was twice a week, then it was 3 times a week, syndicated in more than 360 newspapers. And that was the way you reached the largest audience. That was the best platform you could have in those years. When the famous names were people like Walter Lippmann and Joseph Alsop, or Walter Winchell, whom Bill knew and did not remember he'd met until I found the documentation for it. But he was always looking to young people. Bill, somebody, I think it was Kafka, some legendary figure said, men are either fathers or sons in the way they comport themselves. Bill Buckley was one of the very few, the only one I ever knew who was both. That is to say, he was a great disciple of older figures he met, like Whittaker Chambers, who was one of many. There were others at National Review. The writer James Burnham, who also lived in Connecticut, had a place in Kent, Connecticut. One of his professors at Yale, Wilmore Kendall, was really influential in how Bill Buckley thought and wrote. But he particularly liked bringing young people into the fold at his magazine or through organizations like Young Americans for Freedom, because as a movement builder, he was always looking ahead. The other thing is, he just liked the company of young people. He'd grown up as one of 10 children, and they were broken up into the little groups, which I described. He was part of the middle group. There were the big 4, those are the 4 eldest children, then the 3 who came in the middle, and then there were, what's that, that's 7, 3 more came later. And so he was always looking for companionship and company. On his boat, he liked to take young guys out sailing. It was mostly young men. That was the era he came up in. What was guys who did all these things together. The social clubs he belonged to, the Bohemian Grove, Skull and Bones at Yale, the Fence Club at Yale. You know, those are guys. The CIA was another one of his clubs. And young people appealed to him because he had been a kind of prodigy. You know, intellectual prodigies are really rare. Music prodigies we get, you know, the latest 5-year-old giving a concert at Carnegie Hall. Math prodigies we get, computer prodigies. Literary prodigies are rarer because you can't really write well unless you have some kind of life experience. You can't just imitate other, you know, copy other people's words, or you can, but then you're not a prodigy, you're a plagiarist. Well, so Buckley was always alert for people who seemed to have a glimmer of either original talent or just enthusiasm for the causes he was interested in, or for sailing. I know guys who knew Bill Buckley only as a sailor. They would sail with him 200 or 300 times. One of them told me, my good friend Claudio Velez said to Bill Buckley, said, "I don't understand why you invite me on your sails." He said, "I'm a left-wing Democrat. I'm an atheist, and I totally believe in science. Why do you bring me along?" And Bill Buckley said, "Well, that's why." You know, he wanted the stimulation, somebody who was different, and young people were the ones who'd always throw out the new words, the new fads, the new ideas, and so it really mattered to him. Sorry?
He kept up with things.
He did keep up, yeah.
I'm sorry.
For the author, what do you think Bill would think about the current Republican Party, and what would he want to do about it?
Okay, so here I'm going to congratulate us all Because that's the question that has to be asked, and it took us this long to get there.
I thought it's coming there.
You know, it's one I go back and forth on almost every day because I don't have an answer. Christopher Buckley, his son, doesn't have an answer. He asks me. He says, well, you knew Pup better than I did. What would he think about all this? And the answer is, I don't know. What I have seen or what I found were little hints and clues along the way. If you have anyone who gets this book on Kindle, where you can do a word search, you will find the name Donald Trump once in the 1,000 pages, which include the notes. I guess twice if you include the index. And that's because Bill Buckley and Donald Trump were both character witnesses for their great friend Roy Cohn when Cohn was being disbarred. So I'd file that away. I looked, explored a lot, and talked to Bill Buckley a lot about his relationship with Joe McCarthy, which I think is also a really important episode, and which I know is sending people back to re-examine all of that. And the reason I mention it, by the way, is not just because most people would say Joe McCarthy was not an adornment to our republic, but also because of the way Bill Buckley defended him. And what he defended, really, was not McCarthy himself, though he actually liked him. McCarthy could be very genial and friendly. Joe McCarthy and Pat Buckley would exchange stock market tips over the phone. He was very easy to get along with when he wasn't browbeating or slandering somebody. But what Bill Buckley and his brother-in-law, Brant Bozell, defended was McCarthyism, just as there are many today who will say, well, we're not crazy about Donald Trump, but they're pro-MAGA, or they favor some of the policies. And I think that's where Bill Buckley might align himself. One of the important aspects of Bill Buckley's thinking, I've said he wasn't a philosophical thinker, but he was somebody who was thinking all the time the way most serious people do. He's turning things over in his mind. He's framing arguments. He's working through issues, writing 3 columns a week. He had a better idea, and he was very open about this, about what he was opposed to than what he supported. He is a famous...
That's very important.
Really important. There's a very famous line he had, which I put in a previous book, a little book I did on conservatism. It was published, I don't know, 15 years ago or something, in which Bill Buckley said, you know, you could, if you blindfold me and spin me around like a top, I can pick out every liberal in the room, but I can't tell you who the conservatives are. Because he didn't really know. He didn't really know what a conservative was or what conservatism should be. Something I learned from one of my idols, who was extremely helpful in the writing of this book, Bill Buckley's protege, Gary Wills, but who became an apostate. Bill Buckley was famous for what he called his apostates. They included Gary Wills, Joan Didion was another one. These brilliantly talented people he would find and whose company he enjoyed, who he published in his magazine, then they would disagree over politics and drift away, sometimes, or they would have actual battles about it. But what I learned from Gary Wills was to talk less and think less about conservatism than about conservatives. Because we kind of know who the person is. Like, we recognize, even if Bill Buckley had trouble with it, most of us recognize somebody we think of as conservative, but we'd be hard-pressed to say what conservatism is. And that's where we get into part of the problem with what's going on now. I mean, it's not hard to make the case that Bill Buckley, who in 1957 or 8 told the famous interviewer Mike Wallace that being a self-described counter-revolutionary, that was Buckley's term, another one he used was radical conservative, was that his ambition was to overturn the New Deal. Well, you could look at the first 100 days of Trump 2.0 and say, all right, that's what they're doing. You know? So it's really, really hard to say. If we go back to John's theme and our theme tonight of civility, and my wife says,
Right.
Bill Buckley could not stand just to listen to Donald Trump talk. Just the language alone would be impossible. And
He was never on his show, right?
I think that's an important point. Bill Buckley did 1,500 firing lines. He did firing lines with Groucho Marx. You know, he did them with Borges, you know, the great Argentinian writer. He did not do one with Donald Trump. And yet, when Trump was debating Ted Cruz early on in 2016, it was Trump who mentioned Buckley as example of a Manhattan conservative, which means Trump was very aware of who Buckley was. Buckley wrote about him once. It's probably worth saying, just once that I'm aware of. Describing this will maybe get us somewhere toward answering your question too. If you turn back your mental clock quite a while, there was something called the Reform Party that was started by Ross Perot. Remember him? In 1992, he actually did pretty well for a third-party candidate, but lost. But the party continued. And in 2000, the leading contenders for the nomination were the winner, Patrick Buchanan, the only man I'm aware of who ever defeated Donald Trump for a nomination. And Trump back then wanted to be the nominee. And Bill Buckley wrote a column, this is classic Bill Buckley, in Cigar Aficionado, remember that magazine? Which paid $5 a word, and that's why he wrote the article. Another journalist I talked to once told me, an editor, said the only writer he ever worked with who insisted on being paid the full fee in advance of writing the article was Bill Buckley. And it's not because he was arrogant, it's because he was broke much of the time, but that's another story. And so Bill Buckley wrote an essay about two unusual candidates who were entering politics from the world of entertainment. The first was the really dominant, famous figure, Jesse Ventura. Remember him? Well, the professional wrestler who got elected governor of Minnesota. So it was mostly about Jesse Ventura because he was, and then later he was the main figure. Then later Arnold Schwarzenegger got into the act. But he also wrote about Donald Trump. And he said, what do we think about Donald Trump? He said, well, Donald Trump seems, he says, to be a clinical narcissist. And he said, I mean that in a literal way, that he would look at himself, he looks for his image, you know, in every mirrored surface. And he said he also presents himself as a great businessman, and businessmen are not necessarily good politicians or presidents. So you might ask, well, why didn't I put that in the book? Well, the reason I didn't put it in the book, and I thought long and hard about this, is that there were a lot of people saying things like that about Donald Trump in 1999 and 2000. There were a lot of people, including editors at Bill Buckley's magazine, National Review, who were saying it in 2016. And they're not saying it now. So it seemed to me that wasn't really an accurate, fair measure of where Bill Buckley would be today, because I really don't know. It's hard to imagine him voting for a Democrat. He liked some Democrats. He supported some Democratic friends for Congress he thought were smart and funny. But president's another story. I just don't know what he would have made of the politics. Remember, you know, much of what we hear about now and we're concerned about is what seems to be the disrespect for the rule of law and for the judiciary. Well, one of the first movements Bill Buckley was involved with was the Southern massive resistance to the Brown decision. When the newspaper his family ran, that grew out of the proclaimed massive resistance that 119 national legislators in the Senate and House signed a manifesto saying we'll do everything in our power to keep the Supreme Court from enforcing that decision. So there's a history of that too. That goes back to Bill Buckley.
I want to let you answer your question. I have a 30-second question for you. As I was watching clips of Bill Buckley on various shows, and I realized this was sort of a trademark of his. It made no sense when I saw him on a Tonight Show clip, and he comes in as the guest, and the pen is still there. He is still gesturing with a pen. It's not a debate where he has to take notes down or anything. What was the deal with the pen?
You know, it's funny. I remember seeing him once, just bumping into him in the city. He had his clipboard and he left it behind somewhere. Those were his props, I think.
It was his prop.
There was, yeah, and it was so. You know, one reason he was thrown off, I think, in the debate with Gore Vidal, by the way, was he had his own television program by then, and he was used to being the moderator. The idea
He had the last word.
yeah,
always.
the first word, the last word, and he controlled the debate. And suddenly, that wasn't the case anymore. But yes, he liked to have the pen, the red pen. And the clipboard. Richard Avedon took a great photograph of Buckley with his shoulders and his
Yeah.
clipboard.
I don't know why he was on the Tonight Show. I'm sorry, you've been patient.
He was on the Tonight Show a lot. Yeah.
I'm sorry, thank you. Other than the fact that the book is, I'm 3/4 of the way through it, by the way. Other than the fact that it's 1,000 pages, is there a reason it took so long?
Well,
Did you look at how many sources were in this book?
if you'd said, is there a good reason, the answer would be no. Why did it take so long? And, you know, it's people are surprised when I tell them I'm not really that slow a writer, but I'm a slow thinker. It really takes me a long time to figure out what it is I mean to say and how to say it, which my wife said to me so many times, because if it's a mystery to everybody else, it was an albatross for her. When the book was finally finished, and I did a couple of events, and I would always say, and I'll say it to you, to those of you who thought this book would never get finished, you are not alone. Part of the one reason is it's hard to do it when your subject is alive. And I signed the contract in 1998, and Bill lived another 10 years. And the only modern biography I'm aware of that's really first rate with a living subject, I mean, truly like a great biography, is Robert Caro's A Power Broker. And people forget Robert Moses was alive when that book was published. I think one reason they forget it is that Bob Caro kind of killed him off in that book. So he seemed like a corpse already, but he wasn't. He lived a number of years beyond that. So it's really hard to do it when your subject is alive, is one reason. Another is right around, not long after I signed that contract, I got a pretty big day job. And I remember editing the New York Times Book Review, which a previous, much more talented writer than me and a true protege of Bill Buckley's, John Leonard, do any of you remember John Leonard, the book reviewer and editor of the Book Review? He was one of the young geniuses Buckley found at the age of 19. He was a Harvard dropout. And he'd been the editor of the Book Review, was the greatest editor in its history, actually, till they fired him for publishing really challenging pieces that opposed the war in Vietnam. New York Times was very much with the government of Vietnam, right, for a long time. And John Leonard, there's typical Bill Buckley that he has a protege who turns out to go pretty far to the left. But Buckley remained proud of him till the end. Well, doing that job was a full-time job. And I, unlike my subject, am not a great multitasker. I can really only kind of do one thing at a time. So it took me a while to really sink my teeth into it. And the book actually got written after I left the Times. I had pages before then, but I didn't have a feel for the subject. I know it sounds odd because you think, well, a biography, all you have to do is describe what happened in somebody's life. Why is it so hard to do? Well, in the case of someone like Buckley, it's just so much. And you look for the story. And the story's not always in the places you expect to find it. So that's one reason it took a long time. And then when I had finally completed a first draft, it wasn't 1,000 pages. It was 2,000 pages. And then it had to be cut down to size. And that meant a lot of rethinking and rewriting. Now, there are other writers I know who are faster and smarter and better than me who would have done it a lot more quickly, I concede. On the other hand, I think one advantage was it was almost inevitable. It became a different book. So let me say something about that. I know we're almost at the end here. When I signed the contract in 1998, okay, it was after my biography of Whittaker Chambers had come out, and Bill Buckley had liked it, and Christopher had liked it, and that's why they thought I'd be a good choice to write about his Bill. That was in some ways the peak of the conservative movement Bill Buckley had led. They'd 3 Republicans in a row had been elected president. I mean, three terms, which was the first time really, since Franklin Roosevelt. So it was Reagan twice and George Bush, each in a landslide. Those are the last landslides we've had in presidential elections. The last landslide, believe it or not, was George H.W. Bush in 1988. He won over 400 electoral votes, which no one has done since. So they had 3, and they were both his friends, social friends, and ideological allies. The Soviet Union had collapsed, had been defeated, which Bill Buckley and Alexander Solzhenitsyn and maybe nobody else ever thought would happen, and it did. And the Democratic president who succeeded Bush, the first Bush, was Bill Clinton, who seemed to govern as a kind of almost like a Republican. He was an heir of Ronald Reagan in many respects, and his ideas about the economy and about the Cold War. So you could say this was a triumphant moment. And I thought I was going to be writing the story of someone, of an ideological person who had achieved these extraordinary things. Well, that is part of the story, but it ended up being not all the story. And some of the rest of the story came later. There are things that developed afterwards. Bill Buckley, there's a big moment in the book, and it was for me as his biographer, turned against the war in Iraq pretty quickly and very penetratingly saw it was a problem of the second war under the second Bush, the real war. And I remember asking him if Iraq might be the Republicans' Vietnam, and he said yes. And there is an interpretation that where we are now in our politics is really the consequence. So his story got more and more complicated is another answer to the question.
One of the things, kind of answering the time question that struck me was, I don't exactly know how you do it, because I think as a writer, one of the successes of the book is that it's the show don't tell, right? It takes a lot to decide what you want to communicate, and then he is showing you through the narrative, but then you have to sit in front of people and tell them. It's a completely different thing, right?
Yeah, it's very different.
So there is a lot of discipline in choosing a narrative, and you don't use statements, you illustrate the point you're trying to make.
Yeah, I was pleased to see a review. I didn't expect it. This came up the other day in the Irish Times by a young historian, seems young to me, he's probably 50, but he teaches at Trinity College. And he said that. He said it was a model of showing and not telling.
Is the Irish Times?
The Irish Times, yeah. And the showing and not telling, that's really important to me. I mean, I try to be a storyteller. I think, one reason I say that Bill Buckley wasn't a philosopher and deep thinker, it's partly just a reflection of who I am, because I'm neither one of those things either, and I still think he was kind of great. So I just want to be kind of not misrepresent him, but also do justice to the things he was really good at, like storytelling, and he's a great a raconteur. He could give great physical descriptions, a great observer. Those are things I really admire in a writer, and he had those qualities.
And I'm just going to say this before taking the last question. This says something about the gadgets, and this wasn't at the newspaper. This was at yachting when I was helping them out. They asked him to write something, and he just drives to the office, goes upstairs. This is in the 90s, brings a laptop, which weren't all that common then, goes into a conference room. They had asked him to write a specific thing about sailing, and I swear 20 minutes later came out with a disc and handed it over. I mean, he just walked in, sat down, typed 20 minutes. So sorry, last question? Oh, there's two.
Well, we could take both.
Okay. You get your last. You'll be last.
It's on, right? Quick question. Picking up on critical reviews, would you agree that in the Buckley family and the bringing up, you emphasize things like Lindbergh and the segregation as opposed to opposition to the New Deal, which they viewed as authoritarian or anti-constitutional? And on the last decade or the middle decades of Buckley's life, you downplay perhaps his anti-communism, including Vietnam, his views on Vietnam for better or worse, at the expense of some of the bigger, the Baldwin thing and the Gore Vidal, but perhaps not enough anti-communism, yes or no?
Actually, I thought I did. The last section of the book is about Bill Buckley, the anti-communist, because I agree. I think that was that was Bill Buckley at his best. Buckley, the champion of Solzhenitsyn, the great speech he gave in Notre Dame following Jimmy Carter's speech on human rights. That the arguments Buckley and others had made were being now echoed by dissidents behind the Soviet Union. I actually thought I treated that pretty fully. The question about the New Deal surprises me a little because it's right there at the beginning. You know that the father thought of New Deal as socialism. It's pretty explicit. I think what people want, what some readers may have wanted, I think of the idea, some of the critics on the right, was a more detailed explanation of what the arguments were. But to me, those arguments seemed very simple. They didn't seem complicated to me at all. It was the argument that the business class had always made about the New Deal, and I didn't see that they were developed in any particularly interesting way, and no movement came out of that. Whereas it's the politics Buckley was involved in was movement politics, and that's where Lindbergh was really essential.
Thank you. Who in modern journalism would rise to the level of civility of William Buckley was? That's one. And another one, what was the second language?
French.
French, thank you.
Yeah, which he never learned that well, but he did learn it. Who rises to the level of civility now? Well, no one rises to Buckley's level, I don't think. And I'll say this about Buckley: there's been no one like him since, but there wasn't anybody like him before either. Right. He really was one of a kind, and it has to do with the style and personality as much as beef in sophisticated and serious argument. One thing I admired about him, and I try to convey in the book, is he never talked down to his audience. He always assumed he could use those big words, some of them highly arcane, and complicated syntax and sentence structure, and that people would follow him. He had a lot of faith in the people around him in that way, and I think one reason is because he spoke and lectured so often, traveled to so many places. He had a lot more worldly experience, I think, than ideological people do today, where we live more in the silos that we do. And I think that's true of left as well as right. I think there are journalists who mean to be civil in the same way, including another one of his many, many protégés, David Brooks, I think, tries to do that. But he would be the first to say he doesn't do it with the flair that Buckley did. And that is something it's very hard for anyone else to duplicate. Somebody I interviewed, she was the first wife of Bill Buckley's disciple, early protege, John Leonard, told me she met him when she and John were both in their 20s. They were just gotten married, and Bill Buckley invited them out to Stamford. They were living in a small little apartment in New York, and she said he reminded her of Jack Kennedy, who was her family's idol. He had that kind of charisma, and that's what a lot of it was too. It's a personal magnetism that he had. That is more. It's not just being civil. It's kind of attracting people to you. Like Gary Will said, an exciting person to be around.
Yeah.
The rare, really rare quality. Very few have it.
All right. Well, thank you.
Well,
I know
thank you all.
books are over here.
Very patient audience.